Welcome.
Benvenuti, bienvenidos, hoş geldiniz.
مرحبا.
Willkommen.
Hi, everybody. So can I just say, is anybody still actually teaching in a classroom, or are we all at home now? I thought so. I wasn't sure what the situation was in everybody's different countries. So yeah, in the UK now, we've been teaching from home for 2 weeks now, slightly longer in the university sector, and different schools or institutions coming up with different solutions. I'm also part-time teaching my own children now. Maths for 11-year-olds is harder than I thought it would be, but there you go. Yeah, I hope everyone's okay. So yeah, going to look at the topic of personalization today. And personalization, I think, is possibly a slightly vague term because I think it could be interpreted in different ways. So you could have it as based on your own self-assessment, where you need to be, or teachers' needs analysis at the start of a course, something you often do perhaps in business English. It could be interpreted as adaptive learning, where the software is changing to your own personal needs or ability or aims. And it could be differentiated learning in a classroom, dealing with a range of levels in a mixed ability class. But for this talk, I'm thinking about it from the perspective really of interests, not thinking about it particularly from needs or abilities. There are different ways, I would argue, you could personalize teaching. But here in particular, going to be looking at interests in terms of personalizing it for students. What actually gets them motivated, what gets them talking, what gets them engaged in the classroom. So personalized from that sense. So just to start off, perhaps if you could all put into the chat, any ideas that you have for an answer to this question. So what topics your students like talking about, what engages them? So travel, hobbies, life, new apps, videos, music, sports, family, politics themselves, food, daily life, politics, sports, technology, hobbies, holidays, games. Not very much about themselves, friends, city trips, education, current events, fears, travel, Brexit. Yeah. I don't know how many of you are living your social life via Zoom or things like that at the moment, but that seems to have taken off in the UK here a lot. And everybody currently seems to be able to talk about, perhaps not surprisingly, is the coronavirus. So yeah, current affairs. But outside of this strange situation that we find ourselves in, I would say, I think nearly all of these you've covered yourselves there in the group. Things like TV shows, movies, sports, work, holidays, friends, family, hobbies, their weekend, any plans they have, current affairs or news, food, gossip. So yeah, I'd say these are the sort of things that generally, depending on the student, get them engaged. But one thing that particularly gets people in general engaged is talking about themselves. Researchers have found that face-to-face, apparently we spend 60% of our time talking about ourselves. And when you take that online in social media, to Facebook, to Twitter, etc., 80% of the time we spend speaking about ourselves, which seems like an awful lot of time. I've tried listening to myself a few times lately to see whether this is true. Unfortunately, I think it might be for me. So why do we talk about ourselves so much? Well, there's been quite a lot of research into this sort of topic. One particular study from Harvard University Social and Cognitive Affective Laboratories looked at it via doing MRI scans, so scans of the brain. So what parts of the area would light up when people were talking about themselves or talking about other topics. So when they were given the topics, they were asked to either give their own opinion on the topic or possibly talk about their own personality traits, or they were asked to discuss the same topic but from the perspective of other people, or to talk about other people they knew and traits of that person. And whilst they were doing this, they were just talking out loud. They weren't talking to anyone in particular. And the MRI scan showed that three parts of the brain lit up. Now, the first part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex, and that's the part of the brain that they would expect to light up. It's the part that lights up when we're thinking about ourselves and we're talking about ourselves. But two other parts lit up whilst people were talking about their own opinions or talking about themselves. And those two parts were linked to the dopamine system. So that's part of the brain that's normally connected with reward, with pleasure, with motivation. It's normally connected with things like food, for example, exercise, music, meditation, or sunlight. All these kind of things trigger the dopamine system within the brain, as well as a range of other things. But they were intrigued to see that talking about ourselves or giving our own opinions or talking about our own traits also triggered the dopamine system. What they wanted to find out next was, would it be any different if the speaker knew that someone was listening? So they did the same experiment again. At this time, each person that was speaking brought along a friend or a family member for the second experiment. And when they were given the topic to talk about, they were told that their response would either be shared or private. So they either knew someone was listening to them or they knew that someone wasn't listening to them. And they again did an MRI scan on the brain and found, interestingly, that talking about yourself, even without an audience, essentially feels good. It triggers the dopamine system within the brain. It makes people feel positive about themselves. But talking about yourself with an audience stimulated the brain significantly to such an extent that they were getting such high readings that it was almost like an addiction. There was an incredibly strong response that they were finding. And I think you can probably see that when you look on Twitter and things like that sometimes, or Instagram. That's kind of culture that's come out. The sort of talking about yourself or the self sort of focus is probably arguably increased with technology and social media. But talking about yourself has been important for quite some time. In the past, or even now, really, it's a way of cementing or increasing social bonds, which historically would have been part of self-preservation. If you were out of the group, it was harder for you to survive. You often hear of someone being described as a good listener, and that's when they are often they're asking the other person questions and they're encouraging the other person to talk about themselves. That sort of interaction of allowing people that space to give their own opinion or to talk about themselves creates that social bond. It can also help with personal growth, for example. If you're getting feedback from someone, you're talking about your feelings in your work or in your relationship or something like that, getting that response from someone, again, could help you grow and develop personally. It can also help you work in teams better if you talk it through how you feel about working together. You have a shared responsibility or a shared ownership, then again, it will make you feel more bonded with a group. So you might say, okay, fine, it increases dopamine, but what's the impact on learning? What's the connection to the classroom? Well, personalization and dopamine arguably do have an impact on learning. The research on this says that you can't definitively say higher levels of dopamine do result in better learning. The brain's incredibly hard to pick apart. There are so many factors that are intertwined there. And the exact link is not proven, but there are a number of studies that suggest that the dopamine system does have a positive impact on learning. For example, the reward system is often linked to learning. It can help with improved recall, and it may help retain information. Now, personalization is not the only way to obviously increase dopamine. And some people don't like talking about themselves. Some people feel particularly uncomfortable with it, possibly even definitely in a classroom situation where they don't know many people or they don't consider the people in the room friends. So it's always something you have to obviously judge to a certain extent there. But other ways you can increase dopamine, you could, for example, play games, competitive games. That kind of reward system, that kind of gamification is another way of increasing dopamine. And it gets that level of engagement going and arguably possibly retention with that sort of test nature that gamification can bring in. So another quick question to ask you guys in the chat room. So what do you think stops students from learning? At what point do you think, like, this is not going well, something's going wrong? So yeah, fear. I'd say stress is one, for example, being stressed, boredom, fear about exams, yeah, worries, not motivated, have other things to do that are more fun, yeah, definitely. Wrong temperature, yeah. I once had to teach in the UK where it was about 36 degrees. Everyone wondered why we didn't have air conditioning. I pointed out there was a record temperature in the last 50 years. Too hard, too easy, not interesting. Discouragement for others, tired. Yeah, lack of interest. I think you covered all of the main things that I put on here. Yeah, the boredom, the low motivation, the anxiety, the confusion, the stress. And often some of the things I would say that cause these feelings, it can be, you know, motivations can come from external things, or the anxiety can come from external things. It could be pressure to pass the exam from the institution they're at, or from their employer, or from their parents. That can cause stress as well. There's external and internal sort of things that can cause both of these. Can't stand the teacher. Yeah. Inside the classroom, I would say two things that can often lead to this sort of low motivation or boredom or anxiety is if the topic we're using to teach the language point is overly abstract. So it's something that the students find difficult to relate to. It might not appear relevant to the students. It can be almost irrelevant and too removed from their own personal needs and not connected to their sort of here and now. I think course books can do this quite often. They're trying to come up with a range of different topics to engage a range of different people. And therefore, there's always going to be topics that don't appeal to certain people. But I think there are often ways around this. There are different ways to personalize, either in the course book or with ideas of materials outside the course book. And these are different ways that are suggested that you could personalize. You can add, you could delete or omit something, you could modify, simplify, or reorder. The first three are the ones I'm going to look at mainly here, because I think they're the easiest to adapt materials, to engage your students more, to personalize it more. So in course books themselves, there are already a number of existing personalized tasks. And the ones I'm going to look at here are from the new series writing with Delta Publishing via Collect. It's a new course series called On Point. It's going to be a 6-level series from A1 to C1, so from beginner to advanced. And the ones you can see on the screen here are the pre-intermediate and the intermediate, so the B1, B1 plus. These are out now. The other ones are going to be slightly delayed, well, almost definitely because of coronavirus. So I can still write at home. My wife can still write at home. The editor can still edit at home. The designer can still design at home. The bit where it all collapses is the recording studio. No one wants to be in an enclosed space with other people, and they have to, you know, the microphone is here, one speaker is here, the other speaker is here. They're all closed. All the recording studios are closed. So we're still writing. And as soon as the recording studios are open, we will record the other levels. But until we have clarification on the situation, those ones will be on hold. So it's just the 2 levels at the moment. Sorry, question in there. What's the target group for these books? Young adults and adults, I would say. You wouldn't really probably use them with anyone of school age, possibly in the last year or two. But it's definitely not aimed at younger adults. Isn't it also possible to record the text? It's so difficult to record the texts because if you have an audio conversation, the process when you do it, you would have a director, a sound engineer, the authors, the editors, and then the actors. So you'd need to set up a recording studio in 6 actors' homes, and it would be very expensive. I think the BBC is still doing that for some radio shows and things, but I don't think we could do. The quality could be an issue as well, yeah, setting up in audio sound quality. Hopefully the delay won't be too long, but with coronavirus, it's definitely the how long is a piece of string question applies a lot at the moment. So yeah, just look at a few of the personalized tasks from here and ways you could add or adapt or modify these to perhaps relate to your students more, and how some of them are already quite personalized. So every level starts with a first opening lesson that is focusing on question forms. And those question forms have been structures and tenses that they should already know from the previous level. Obviously, you can't do that with a beginner, but all of the other levels, they're not going in there with a lot of new language here. It's a series of tasks that essentially should get the students talking and engaged, being able to talk about themselves. As you hopefully can see here, they're listening to a model. They then have 2 tasks where they're completing questions and discussing the questions with each other, followed by then some grammatical focus and then more questions. So the whole thing is very, very, the target group, yes, is 16 plus, yeah. It's all very much question and answer, getting the students to get them talking in the first lesson with the material all there on the page, etc. But you can also go in with ideas not from on the page. The sort of classic true or false statements where you write 4 sentences about yourself, 1's false, 3 that are true. People have to ask questions to work out which one is false. I often find personally, if you're willing to open up, students are more willing to open up. And so one thing you could do once you've been through the grammar is get students to produce half a dozen questions or however many questions to ask the teacher, add them to the board, deal with any grammatical issues, and then you personally can answer them. Photo chat, taking in photos of, for example, a holiday you went on or an interesting place you've been to, getting them to ask questions about that and talking about that, or writing a profile. For homework, for example, you could get them to write a profile, like a social media profile, that they then hand in. You can have a look at for an analysis of the language to give you an idea of their ability a bit more. But also it's a way of getting them to put in personal information so that you can find out stuff to maybe target or tailor your lessons to topics that might engage them as the course goes on. This is a very old quote, but essentially is highlighting the importance of warmers, really. Trying to personalize a topic from the start. So even if the topic is a little bit abstract, I think if you can bring it into a personal focus and a personal nature from the very start, then it can make that more abstract topic feel more personalized by them bringing their own knowledge or their own experience to that topic. For example, here's a page from the intermediate book where the topic is looking at, or the language focus is on grammar, phrases related to time for the vocabulary. And the warmer here is getting to score yourself on these different statements. So how flexible are you with plans? How much do you like to plan things? How do you feel about people being late? You miss a flight because your friend is disorganized. How do you feel? and getting them to put scores from don't care to angry on each of these, and sharing their sort of feelings with each other about those. Or this one where you're talking about connecting with friends, it's looking at question tags and friendships, vocabulary to describe friendships, talking about their oldest friend, how long they've known them, how often they see them, and any friends they've lost touch with and why they've lost touch with them. So these are just sort of some of the sort of simple warmers you can have at the start. I think one thing you can possibly do is respond to, lineup games are also fun. Yeah. My wife, Kathy, who's co-authoring this with me, did one of those recently, those volunteer classes she was teaching in until a few weeks ago, where they're real mixed ability. And you don't know who's going to turn up because they're free classes. And yeah, lineup game is a great way for them to all be able to like take part and join in whilst you're gauging their level and things like that before you can then sort of adapt your pitch of lesson. But yeah, here, telling your students how you'd personally react. So me personally, I'm really not flexible with plans. I really like to know when things are going to happen, and I get quite frustrated with people being late. And I think if you open up a little bit about your feelings, missing a flight, I did miss a flight because of a friend. It was incredibly annoying. I seem to have a lot of friends who are not very good with planning, and I'm quite obsessed with planning. So don't know why it works. But yeah, giving them a little bit about how you might feel, or talking about a friend you've lost touch with and why you lost touch, moving away. Speed dating games are good fun too. Yeah, they are definitely like I played one with students recently where you had to, rather than dating, they had to find a new flatmate. So you take those questions, for example, from that first lesson, you put half the class around the room, sat on the table. Others have to move around and ask questions to decide who they'd be willing to share a flat with. So it works the same way as speed dating. It's just 1,000,001 questions as quickly as possible, and trying to work out who would be best for them as a flatmate. And that sort of fun element to it also helps them to relax a little bit, especially when they maybe don't know each other that well in there. Something else I think we've tried to do a lot of in the course is put target language into questions or opinion statements. So there's something automatically to discuss as soon as they've finished the task. So for example, here on this lesson on the futures of going to, the phrases we have underlined here, you can possibly just say waste time, hesitate, flexible, get things done in advance, fill up, commitment, etc. We've put these directly straight into questions that students complete after having read the text and done some comprehension on the text. They then put these words into questions that they can then ask and answer instantly. So they're getting it into a useful context, a personalization context straight away, rather than a sort of an empty sentence that is just there to narrow down what words or what grammatical structure should fit there. Putting it into an opinion, for example, that they then respond to afterwards and discuss with students is another way of doing it. Using photos, I think, can be a great one, especially with the number of photos everyone has on their phone nowadays. There's an example of a lesson in B1 on the present simple and present continuous. You can't quite see, but in the top right there in the green are people's sort of pretend social media posts. Often you find social media posts on with one-line statements are in the present continuous, talking about what they're doing now. They've got a couple of examples. You could then get students to bring up their own photos and write their own social media post as if that was an event actually happening now. Photos are a great way with a lot of different things you can do to extend or adapt for practicing vocabulary or grammar that you've been looking at. So you can photograph the area you live in, you can photograph activities you like doing, a weekend that you've just had, your lunch, your dinner. And you can think of all the different things you could do with those, whether it's wanting to do something with the past simple, wanting to do something with food vocabulary or places around town, etc. And students could then, as a follow-up to the lesson, do the same themselves, take photos of whatever the topic is that you've been doing and write their own posts, for example, or bring those photos into class and talk about them with their partner to say what they were doing at that point or what they ate for their lunch on that day, and naming all the different things or where they went, etc. So quite a good, fun way of personalizing that language to them. So this is an example. Every 2 units, we have a video lesson. And the video lessons are revising the vocabulary and the grammar of the previous 2 lessons on a new sort of topic and angle. Yeah, they'd have the photo on the phone in class. Yeah. Yeah, you could. Yeah, you could use adjectives to describe family, like family members is a great way. You could talk about their personality. You could talk about in a very simple way of how they look, like their appearance and things like that. Yeah, I think there's a lot you can do with photos personally. Yeah, so here's another example. So a video lesson, and here it's looking, if you can just see the text there, 5 signs you grew up, and there's text there in the 1950s and in the 1970s. Here for the video, we interviewed people on the streets in London. One great thing with London is there's people visiting from all over the world and living there and working from all over the world. So we have people in the video from America, from Germany, from Sweden, Norway. It's really, really good for that kind of thing. And before watching it, they read these texts. So people are answering the questions: what did they like about what did you like about your childhood? What didn't you like about your childhood? What was good about growing up in the 70s? What was good about growing up in the 80s, etc. And in the text here, it's like 5 signs you grew up in each of these different decades. So one thing you could do here is simply personalize it to the decade that the students grew up. So I grew up in the 80s, 90s. So what would you say are 5 signs you grew up in the 80s? Anyone got any ideas? A Walkman, yeah. Recording songs from the radio. I did that. Hairstyle, shoulder pads, music choice, horrible haircut. Punk, yeah, the style, the genre, the clothing, tape recorder, neon colors, neon. Yeah, I think this is something you can get. Video recorders, yeah. My son, when he was like 4 or 5, used to endlessly feed DVDs into the video recorder. I wonder why it wasn't working. Moonwalk, computers when you, yeah, and sitting there waiting for 40 minutes for a computer game to load. I remember that as well. Yeah, so there's all sorts of things, and you could bring this up for whatever decade your students were in. They're sort of their, late childhood or their early teens, and make them think of and discuss together. And if you have a mixed age range as well, that's great for them to talk about and compare. Yeah, these are the ones I thought of. Had a video player, computer game took 40 minutes to load. Everyone listened to your phone calls. You just had a landline, like it was in the living room. You couldn't have a private phone call. You created mixtapes, and you read news on CFAX and teletext. These, I think, were like British things. I guess you had. It was where you brought up news in text form on the TV. Did you have things like that in your own countries? I guess so. I think CFAX and teletext we had here. Yeah, video conference took 20 minutes to load. Yeah. Yeah, so these kind of things that you can remember from like your childhood, and like, again, just personalize it for them rather than it being just an abstract text about how life was different in the 50s or the 70s. They can think about, times that you grew up. If you would imagine someone growing up in the early 2000s, everyone had a digital camera. No one has a digital camera really now. You use your phone. Everyone started to shop online in the late 90s, so early 90s, no one was shopping online. The internet was not readily there. So all these different things that would just personalize that topic a little bit more before you showed the video. And then if they particularly engage with them, like the video, They could then go and ask those questions to other people and record their responses. So again, you personalize that and can play that afterwards at the end. You lined up to get your vibe of your favorite band. Yeah, nobody cares if people listen to their phone calls. Yeah, yeah. But you have the opportunity to walk. Yeah, yeah. Diskette. Yeah. Mini discs. Never see those now. So yeah, essentially, you can adapt or simplify. You can practice in class. You can practice in real life. Here's an example from the A2 level, a lesson on eating out. And you can, if you're lucky enough that you have, for example, an Irish bar or an English bar or something like that in your own hometown, then you can get students to go in there and try and practice ordering after they've had a go in the lesson in class. Then they can go in and practice as they would if they were going on holiday. But if you're lucky enough to have something like this, it's not great food usually, but it gives them an opportunity to go and try it out and gain a little bit of confidence, maybe. Away from the course book. So these are all examples I've looked at so far are from using the course book, changing it slightly, how to add to it, how to adapt it. Obviously, you can do things without the course book. Asking students about topics that interest them, that engage them. Doing this right at the start of the course or intermittently throughout the course. Some people will open up more as they get more confident with who they know and the people they know and realize they have something in common with someone. Those topics will adapt and change, and as current affairs as well. So if you have an idea of the topics that engage the students, then you can find reading text on those from the newspaper. You can find video clips from YouTube or from Netflix or something like that. So you can find news stories and then write your own comprehension text to those. If you find that they engage particularly with, so for example, in the On Point course in the third lesson, it's a reading text. And sometimes these are sort of newspaper style articles, other times they're extracts of a novel. And practiced one of those recently with students, and they really engaged with the story. And there was a Sherlock Holmes one, and there were episodes of this on YouTube, and so they could go away and watch that. So it's sort of springboarding off. But then if they like that, you can go and find other things of a similar genre if they're particularly interested in like crime stories or thrillers that engage them. And they're willing to go away and do it. It doesn't feel like homework. It just feels like fun. Show and tell. Yeah, students present on a topic, an object that's important to them. You often might do it with children, but I think you can still do it with adults. I think it's quite, they have to feel comfortable enough and willing enough to open up to each other. Could feel a bit too personal sometimes. Like I say, not everyone wants to open up like that, but they can, yeah, once they feel comfortable with the people in their class, then they're more than willing to do this quite often. Bring in, some dance trophy or football trophy or something they won when they were a child. Bring in their favourite novel. Bring in something from their holiday that they went on that was their favourite holiday. And then they can talk about that and why it's important to them, why they enjoyed that experience, etc. And then making their own video can either be a monologue, a short sort of monologue talking directly to the camera themselves, or a short film. If you're trying to teach narrative tenses and do a story, and you've been doing that, then they could perhaps produce a short little story and then play it in class, and other students can write essentially the story out in text, describing what happened, and then using the target language that you want. For adults that did in German class with doctors, they brought articles or photos of instruments or cases according to the topic. They loved it. Yeah, yeah. There's so many different ways that you can do that. Engage. kids react to 80s technology on YouTube. Yeah, I've seen that. That is quite funny. You don't, often you don't have to go to the 80s. Bring out some of the 90s technology and they freak out. Yeah, that is very funny. So yeah, I would say talking about ourselves, is our own opinion, our own experiences. It generally increases dopamine levels in students, and there is a reasonable amount of research to show that dopamine can enhance learning. As I say, people don't always feel confident and comfortable talking about themselves. There can be cultural reasons or personal reasons. Another great way to enhance dopamine is a competitive element, a game element. If students or yourself don't feel comfortable with that personalization, then perhaps taking the game approach would be one that you would enjoy more. Using photocopiable games that you find in the teacher's book, for example, is getting those parts of the brain triggered will often cement learning and concentrate the language and your ability to recall that. So yeah, does anybody have any questions at all?